Well, I'm going to talk about the novelty, the novel aspect, because the virus is called as a novel coronavirus. So I'm going to deconstruct this term novel in my today's deliberation. In the morning session, Professor Joshi talked about that COVID-19 is a concept is for anthropologists. This is a problem which anthropologists are well placed in dealing, in handling it. But if we look at it at present, anthropology is perhaps the most affected discipline in terms of carrying out its work in the present circumstances. Social anthropology has prided itself. The crux of our practice has been empirical understanding based upon up close, a personal, in situ, the term which Professor Srivastav used in his deliberation, in understanding of a subjective reality objectively. Now, this very trick of a trade have been grounded by the situation which prevails with COVID-19. The way out, Professor Srivastav used the term, anthropologists, they are great in adapting themselves to varied kind of situations. And we have also tried to adapt ourselves through using new ways of doing ethnography, as exemplified by Professor Srivastav through the use of smartphones and other studying culture at a distance, which was very popular during the 50s. We are trying to once again reinvigorate them in the contemporary times. But having said this, how successful they would be, how satisfied we would be is a big question mark. But my submission here is that although empirical understanding based upon fieldwork and participant observation is the bread and butter of social anthropology, there is something called as anthropological framework, an anthropological lens in understanding a problem. And it is this anthropological framework, this anthropological lens, which I'm going to use today to understand the present COVID-19 situation. Now, this anthropological framework is constituted of an amalgamation of the structural and interpretive method, wherein three things form the crux of my argument. Breaking down the phenomena into its constituents units, seeing the relationship between these units, the linkages and the interrelationship, and based upon these linkages and the interrelationship, trying to come some kind of an interpretive understanding of the situation. Now, if in medical anthropology has looked at infectious disease through a model. The model which was made popular by Merrill Singer and others, which talked about that when you are talking about infectious diseases, you don't have to look at it only in terms of a relationship between an individual and a pathogen. They said that we have to break down the individual into three aspects: the psychological aspect, the cultural aspect, and the behavioral aspect. And the fourth aspect they talked about is the biology or the body. All these four aspects, they interact with the host, they interact with the infectious pathogen in what is called as the political economic environment. So when we look at infectious disease and how we understand infectious disease in context of human society, there are these 5 components: psychology, culture, behavior, political environment in context of human, individual, and we have the pathogen, and encompassing whole this thing is the environment, the ecology, the web of biotic and abiotic component, which is enveloping all this. I am going to add one more factor to it, the factor called as novel. It is called as novel. Why do we call it as novel? We call it as novel because this is something new. Now, if you look at the etymology of the term novel, novel has another meaning. Novel has another meaning in terms of a friction. So what I'm going to look at it is in terms of what is called the newness and what is called the friction of COVID-19. Now, the whole thing about the novelness boils down to, this is a virus about which we know very little. As we know very little, it is something which is dangerous. Now, this is very close to how we have defined danger in context of social anthropology. We have the famous anthropologist Mary Douglas, who says in her work on purity and danger that anything which we can't classify, which we can't order, where our knowledge is limited, we call it as danger. Now, to begin with, is coronavirus really dangerous? Now, that's a question mark, which will, as the time unfolds, it would be answered. Now, to begin with, what is the most novel about this? All epidemics, they have been dangerous in their own ways. Epidemics have killed more people. Epidemics have infected more people. What is novel about the coronavirus? The novel thing about the coronavirus is, well, this is first time we are experiencing an epidemic. We are experiencing an epidemic before the experiential reality. We are exposed to a construction of the epidemic. And the construction which I'm talking about is the construction of the epidemic by the media, the construction by the internet. Now, what is the crux of this construction? The construction is based on the horror of the epidemic. We were acquainted with the horror of the epidemic before the experience of this epidemic. And what this horror constituted of? This horror constituted of certain images. What were these images? The images which were beamed to us were of crowded hospital with no beds, hospitals where people are lying on the ground. There are no places in cemetery to bury people. There are people who are dying on the roads. There were all these pictures which created a context of fear, anxiety, and stress and horror before the actual experience of the epidemic happened in our context. Now, this fear, this whole horror, it is what clouded our reaction to the epidemic. Now, this is the second novel factor I'm going to point out. Our reaction to the epidemic has been little over the board. There may be people who may contradict me, but perhaps when the history will be written of this epidemic, one line would definitely be written that in this case, the cure of the epidemic was worse than the disease. And this cure being worse has been amply spoken about by the speakers before me in forms of the migration crisis, in forms of the neglect of the other diseased people, in form of the other social crisis that affected us. Alfred Schultz used the word limited rationality when we talk about human beings and human beings' reactions in everyday life. He says it is all guided by rituals, and rituals, they are not purely based upon complete rationality, they are based on quasi-rationality. And in this time of pandemics, what we have seen is a rationality which has been totally biased, as Professor Srivastava pointed out in the morning in his deliberation, that how our reaction initially was guided by a middle class oriented protective philosophy of lockdown. A lockdown which resulted in the migrants not just being made to suffer. It is they being made to humiliate, shedding them of their pride by making them beggars to civil societies. Now, having said this, the third novel factor we move towards this to this epidemic is how it has reoriented our understanding of the concept of disease and concept of health. It has really challenged the Western understanding of health and disease. And it has caused havoc in those societies which were very proud of their public health systems. It has really brought them to the knees by showing them their place, that what you pride of is something you need to be humble about. So this epidemic has really challenged our notion of a pathogen causing a disease. The comorbidity factor which we are talking about, how this virus with comorbidity becomes a deadly virus, is something which is not much known in medical sciences. Much needed to be done in enhancing our understanding of the syndemic relationships, how pathogen acts with respect to human body. Now let us come to the political economic factor. The message which these virus sends us, this epidemic sends us, Peter Snowdown in his book, Epidemic and Society says, as Professor Srivastava also said in the morning, that all epidemics, they are mirror to our society. They show us the fault line. Now, what fault line this epidemics represents to us? The fault line. Oh, sure.
1 minute, yes.
Yeah. The fault line which this epidemic shows is what is called vulnerability. Our whole public policy of understanding, defining, of accounting vulnerability is not at all there. We have been shying away from deliberating and coming to a scientific understanding of vulnerability. Second, the second important this pandemic shows to us is how we have completely neglected unorganized sector of the economy. The unorganized sector of the economy, which is so significant for our growth, our economic progress, our GDP, has been completely neglected by the policymakers. And it is high time we try to have the unorganized sector organized and documented, registered. Let it be in the notion of the public policy that there is something called as unorganized sector. And it is this unorganized sector which has been most affected. Professor Srivastava talked about work, and he talked about work in terms of classification, those who work from home and those who work from outside. There's a third category also. Those who work from outside but could not work. Those who work from outside could work. They did work. But there were people who wanted to work, but had to work outside, but were not allowed to work. They were the real tragedies of the epidemic, in which we have to talk about. And the last factor which I will draw your attention is all epidemics, they carry a lesson with, and this epidemic has also carried a lesson with it. And the lesson is we have to take nature seriously. Speakers before me have spoken about how Anthropocene has played a role in the creation of this epidemic. I need not elaborate upon it. The message which this epidemic is sending is, this is not the last, this is the beginning. We better watch out. And if we don't watch out, we will be wiped out. This is the message. The history has shown that pathogens, they have annihilated life in this earth. They have also created life in this earth. If we do not watch what we are doing, the day is not far away when we will also be part of the prehistory. Thank you so much for listening to me so patiently.